This is Three Brothers Movie Reviews, and we just got finished rewatching Jonathan Demme's The Silence of the Lambs. We saw it at the same cinema where we watched The Thing. Great movie theater to go to. Film stars Jodie Foster, Anthony Hopkins, and it is about a FBI trainee named Clarice Starling, who is asked by her superior to interview a incarcerated serial killer named Dr. Hannibal Lecter for information about an active serial killer named Buffalo Bill, who has recently kidnapped a girl. And the film becomes a race against time as Clarice is attempting to peel back layers of the case, and Dr. Hannibal Lecter is trying to peel back the layers of Clarice. So this film is a masterpiece. Like,
yes.
out of the gate, we're not gonna like say like this is that. Like this movie is pretty much out of the docket a masterpiece. So
yeah.
We're just gonna try to get into like specifics on what the movie is great. So
yeah.
People oftentimes go to performances for this movie, and rightfully so. Anthony Hopkins is everything that you've heard he is. Really interesting note, he's only in 16 minutes. He only has 16 minutes worth of screen time inside of this film, and
it feels like more. Like I knew that going into this movie, that he's only in a brief period of time, but he seems to just take over the film at one point.
I've heard a great description, which is that he doesn't have much screen time, but his presence resides throughout the rest of the movie.
Oh yeah.
And that's exactly what it is. You feel him after he's introduced, that like he's there. It's really eerie, and like, you know, all the performances are so fantastic. So
a lot of the supporting cast is great too.
Yeah,
like,
the smaller characters.
I don't remember I don't remember the actors' names, but the two people who were supporting characters that I really loved in this movie were Barney, who's like the lead orderly at the mental hospital that contains Lecter. I love like there's these little isms that you get from him, that he sort of has this cautious respect of Lecter, in that he knows what he's capable of, but he's not a nasty person to him. So you get the feeling that Lecter kind of respects him in turn, even though his job is basically to keep him in this prison cell for the rest of his life.
There's that moment before Clarice goes in to interrogate him, and he says, "I'll be watching," and like he seems very reassuring. Like there's this slight aspect of safety. Like she's going in, and it's like the gates to hell, but he's there. Like I'm gonna be watching you. Like you feel a little bit there with him. So
yeah, and I can't remember her name, but it was her friend.
Yeah,
like there was a few scenes with her, which were great.
Character in the movie.
Like, and she's really good. Like she's clearly a friend to Clarice, and they've been in the academy together, and they work well off each other. Like there's some scenes where you could just have Clarice alone and it might work, but it's a lot better when she's interacting with someone else as an equal, who's not like Lecter, a much more dangerous person to be bouncing up things off of.
Yeah, you don't get too many sequences with her, but the sequences with her stand out. Yeah,
so we could easily talk about performances, but there's a lot more in this movie that really warrants talking about, things that maybe are not as highlighted as in many reviews of this film.
Yeah, so first of all, this is going to be a spoiler review. If you've not seen Silence of the Lambs, please see it without any trailers, without anything. It's the best way to go into any movie. I always say that, but this movie is great. See it. We're going to get into spoilers here. So first thing to talk about, everyone talks about performances. Let's talk about Jonathan Demme's direction.
Yes.
We looked this up before we went here. Like, I think it was 19 or 18 films. It was under 20 films that he has directed. And he passed away, I think in the mid-2000s. That's a shame, man. Like, great director. And what stands out particularly for me is the conversations. Like, this is technically a thriller film, like a serial killer thriller, but the scenes which are just amazing is the conversations. So let's talk about that. Shot reverse shot is just a very basic cinematic aspect. You know, you cut back between two different characters, they're having a conversation, you cut back as they exchange lines. It's very casual, but there's different ways of doing that. The particular way is over the shoulder or frontwards. The Coen brothers do that a lot. They do in between the conversations. You know, you don't see the other person.
Yeah, you see, but usually with a shot reverse shot, you often see both characters in frame.
Yeah, like Michael Mann did that in Heat. Like, that's one of the most iconic conversation scenes, the dinner scene between them. Like, you see over the shoulders, and like you can see both of them, and it cuts back between them and in between each. So, but that's great. In this movie, one of the most traditional shot reverses is like literally their face, like right in camera, and then it cuts back between the two of them.
And their eye line is right at camera. It's not looking off. It's not implying that you're seeing a conversation from afar. A character is looking straight at you, at another character.
It's one of my favorite moments in the film. It's like literally when Clarice meets Lecter, and he says "closer," and then
Right.
and then you just move in on his face, and it's just right there, and it's like there's no room to breathe. Like the glass in front of them, that was like this barrier,
Yeah.
disappears, and like that's the standard throughout the rest of the movie. Is that shot kind of shows the main character having dominance, because again, that's something else in addition to shot reverse shot is like angles.
Yes.
It's a very traditional thing which just can show you the slightest thing. Is like if one character is angled down and the other character is like from a high angle, that can show a bit of a slight dominance that the main character may have. Like
Right.
they do that, Damien Chazelle did that in Whiplash. Like they're just the slightest little tweaks in that instead of sequences. It's a nice little detail which can show just effort behind the director.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of frame is just even. That shows the character in power. And like when other characters will like kind of land blows with lines of dialogue,
Right.
different characters will like kind of twist to the side of frame. Maybe they'll be shot from the side. Maybe like another character will have a zoom in, and like there's so much going on with
Yeah.
the dialogue sequences. Like the dialogue is good, but the direction like enhances it. It makes it so that the conversations are enthralling.
I really love, there's a scene where, like one of the most famous scenes in this movie is when Clarice first meets Lecter.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is the way that the staging happens. You basically, like, Clarice is walking down a long hallway and she sees Lecter in his cell, completely ready for her, looking straight at her, standing up. And then they have a brief conversation, and then he asks her to sit. He does not sit, he stands. And he basically spends the remainder of the scene looking down at her.
Yeah.
But the thing that really stuck out to me is the next time she visits him, she's sitting on the floor. And initially we can't see where Lecter is in the cell. There's this really creepy moment where she's looking around the cell, and you know he's there, but you can't see him.
Yeah, you're like, is he by the bed? Is he like, it's just shadow.
Right.
And you're like, where is he?
And then you notice he's sitting down as well at the same level she is.
Yeah, when the lights turn on, like it's a cool moment to switch between. Yeah, and then there's the third scene with her where she's offering him the deal, and he's sitting down. She has the high angle. She's shot straight on.
Right.
But then when he notes about the island, then it goes where they have the same shot. Like
Right.
both of them have shot reverse in the face, and like that's the type of thing you can look at every single scene and you can determine what's going on just based on the cinematography. Even if the characters were not talking, you could determine what's happening based off of the cinematography and direction.
That's really the biggest thing I think that we can both agree on in this movie, is that the camera tells the story. You could possibly watch this movie on mute and get a really rewarding experience just from how the camera is moving about and just the dynamics between characters from where they're physically situated from each other.
Yeah. With jumping a little bit to the horror track, let's talk a little bit about that. Like, I would classify this as a horror movie. Like, I've heard people debate against it. I really would classify it as that. It's psychological horror, and I think it's like horror of the mind. That's the key with the movie. It's not like...
I think I think a good broad genre is horror, but I feel that this movie is more effectively classified as a serial killer film.
If you want to go
like,
specific genre,
because I think oftentimes
psychological thriller isn't right.
There's a lot. I think a lot of films are put into the horror bucket, and unfortunately, horror as a genre, I think, it's just so broad.
Yeah,
it's like comedy.
Yeah,
like, do you mean Groundhog Day or like a bad Adam Sandler comedy?
Yeah, or like Edgar Wright. You know, like there's different layers of comedy.
For me, this movie is like The Shining. Like, plenty of people don't like horror movies, but almost everybody likes The Shining.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the way I would usually sell this movie to people. Is I'm like, it's a serial killer drama. It's a horror film, but it's specifically a serial killer drama. Like, there's more to this movie than just the horror elements.
Yeah.
There's something for everyone that can make this a film that's enjoyable, even if you generally don't like movies that are specifically use a lot of horror elements.
Yeah, because the cinematic strengths
Yeah.
stand out above like the blood and guts. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So one of those things I'd like to talk about is the introduction of Hannibal Lecter's character. Like, a jump scare is all about subversion. It's all about like you think something is going to happen and then that's what a jump scare is about. And like there's something like that isn't a jump scare. It's just a build to a reveal where like who is Hannibal Lecter, and it cuts. It's like, oh, he's a monster. He's our most valued specimen here. And then like you have these expectations that build along, like he's along the cell.
I remember like there's that bit where the hospital director shows her a picture. You don't see it, but it's a picture of what happened when they relaxed on security and he mauled a nurse and ate her tongue.
He just describes that, like what's happening. You never see that picture, and there's these building of expectations. You pass these 3 different cells, and it gets like crazier and crazier till you get to Miggs, who's like along like, and then it cuts to Lecter, and he like the cell's neat. It's well lit. He's just standing there, and there's this pause, and then he just says, "Good morning," and it's like. He seems so orderly, and at the same time, that's so horrifying. Like his composure is terrifying, and like there's lots of stuff like that where the film sets up things, and you're kind of not sure whether to trust it. You're not sure whether to trust what's on screen. It's really amazing.
It's a great exploration of like expectation and what you actually get.
Yeah.
Like, I think that applies to a lot of things in this movie. Like, this whole movie is essentially about the FBI trying to hunt down an active serial killer called Buffalo Bill by initially trying to research captured serial killers to see if they can put together a profile. And basically, the reason why Clarice is first sent to Dr. Lecter is he's not cooperating with the FBI. So when she goes to visit him, it's to hopefully get his aid on this.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that they send her not really expecting, like Jack Crawford, played by Scott Glenn, who is fabulous in this movie.
Yeah, great performance.
Love Scott Glenn in this movie. He sends her without a lot of expectation of her being successful.
Yeah.
And I think up to the point when Lecter finally drops the polite act and basically calls her white trash, I think that was the point where normally it'd be over. Conversation's over. Lecter's not talking. But then she breaks her civility and calls him out on, okay, you want to be that intrusive on me. Why don't you be intrusive to you? Oh, you probably won't do that. I think that was the moment when
he felt challenged.
He liked her. He liked that she was willing to talk back.
Like at the beginning, he's kind of predicting. He's like, you're one of Jack Crawford's, and he says like, Jack Crawford sent a trainee, and like that's something which reflects curiosity but not intrigue. Like he's just like not sure.
And he teases her later, like she's trying to be polite, and then she pulls out the questionnaire Jack gave her. And he's like, "Oh no, you were doing fine."
Yeah, he's like reading her, like going along the path, because he's smart. He's not someone who like is being led by the cops. Like you have to keep up with him.
Right.
So yeah, great stuff there with the way the characters interact.
And talk about a great relationship.
Yes.
Like this untested, smart, but very new to the game FBI trainee put in a prison with this very, very dangerous guy.
I remember you and I talked about this with Suspiria 2018. We were trying to describe Madame Blanc and Susie's relationship in the movie, because it's very much there, but we couldn't like really slap a label on it. It's similar in this movie where you're like, what exactly are they? They're not friends, they're not in love, but it's this bizarre like respect for each other and almost like intrigue with each other where there's this connection. It's
intimate.
Yes.
That's the best word I can use. And I think that what we were talking about, the close-ups, like almost every scene where they have a conversation, at some point there will be these tight close-ups of their face.
Yeah.
And it'll switch between tight close-up of Lecter, back to a tight close-up of Clarice, and they're not physically that close to one another, but you get this sense that they're having an extremely intimate conversation. It's not. I can't really describe beyond that. It's intimate. There's some intimate, close relationship that they have that's just strange and enthralling to watch.
I noticed that with the cameras, with a lot of the later conversations, when they talk about the case, it usually will cut back to more distant shots, but when they talk about themselves, it'll cut back. Like Lecter turns around at one point and it's at his face, and then you see Clarice's face.
I love that angle where it's looking up at him.
Yeah, and then towards the end you have like the zoom in with Lecter, like kind of going in between the bars, and like the bars just disappear. Like, yeah,
that last conversation they have where the camera is, their whole face is in frame. Their whole face.
There's nothing else. I've described it that way. There's like no room to breathe, and like I can only imagine that like Jonathan Demme like literally like had the camera right there, and I'm like to be that like. To not even break the fourth wall, because it's not like he's looking at the camera, it's like he's looking at Clarice. But yeah, what they did with the camera for the conversations is great. Like the relationship between them is like it's hard to describe, but there's something genuine and close. Like that's the best way to describe it. Intimate. Yeah. They're close to each other, and they gain this deep respect for each other. It's great. Yeah. So you want to talk about specific scenes here, like getting a little bit more into that. Something I might want to go over just briefly is people talk about Hannibal Lecter, but Buffalo Bill is a little discomforting to watch inside of his scenes.
He's terrifying. Ted Levine, I think he must be he must have less screen time than Lecter.
I think so.
I feel like he has like maybe 5-7 minutes maybe every scene he's in. Like there's this scene where it's been mocked a lot. The line where it puts the lotion on its skin or else it gets the hose again.
It rubs the lotion on its skin or else it gets the hose again.
He's talking to one of his soon-to-be victims in this pit he's dug in his basement, and that scene really freaked me out because there's this point where he's bringing this bucket up and he's got this lamp attached to it, and as he's pulling it up, his soon-to-be victim sees all the bloody handprints of people before her who have tried to get out, and it does this zoom in and you see a fingernail that's broken off in the wall, and she starts screaming, and he looks down just with this odd look on his face, and then he just starts to go like it's like he's like trying to mimic her in this weird way, not in a mocking way, but just like this weird like he's like the whole movie is really revolving around him trying to like transform himself into someone he's not, and so he's sort of taking on the characteristics of his victims while they're still alive in his basement.
It's almost like that moment in Nightcrawler where like Jake Gyllenhaal's like looking at the TV and like and he's like laughing at the
practicing
movie.
Laughing.
Exactly. It's like he's like practicing humanity. That's what it feels like in the entire movie. Like every scene that it cut back to him, I just wanted the movie to move on. It was just like, I don't want to be near him.
It felt real. Like most, and I'd even say this about Lecter. Lecter doesn't feel like a real. Okay, let me clarify that.
He's too good to be true.
He's too good to be true. Like I don't imagine that he is based on a real person. I'm like, okay, he's just too magical and wonderful to be a real person.
Yeah, people have said he's like partially based on Ed Gein. Like, nah,
not really.
They made him up. He's
like honestly, Buffalo Bill feels like he's a real serial killer.
He does.
Like he has that bit at the beginning where he has the fake arm cast on. He's trying to like load the couch, and I'm like, that's Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy did that. Like a lot of the stuff that he does in this movie, I'm like, I can imagine this guy existing in the real world.
Yeah.
And that's something that's really, I think, important to talk about this movie. This movie doesn't hold back on the horrific stuff that comes with tracking serial killers.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, we were talking about the body scene. They find a body in West Virginia. It's, I think, the 4th victim. And
it's revealed to be the first, I think.
Is it the first? Okay.
He weighed it down, so they found it. It's been like decomposing
You're right.
for a long time.
The 3rd body they found, but it was the first body of the person he killed. And it's great because basically you're in this room, and initially it's full of cops. You don't see the bodies in there until they all leave, and it's just this body bag. And there's this painfully long process before they even open up the bag, and then you just have the camera doing this, looking up at the faces of the characters who are looking down at this corpse.
Like I said, the body materializes in your mind based off of the reactions of the characters. Like you're left to wonder, and like when it ends, like when you see it, it isn't even all that shocking anymore because you've basically seen the body in your mind.
Right.
Yeah, like the way this film like deals with serial killers, it feels real. Like the process of like tracking, it doesn't feel like made for a film. It feels like something that could come from reality.
Right.
And yeah, the way the FBI is handled, it's great. Are there other things you want to talk about? Like this
is one thing I really want to talk about.
It's a movie which really should be analyzed. That's the thing.
You had previously reviewed this movie on your website, and one of the things that you had highlighted is that Clarice Starling is a fascinating character.
Yes.
Both from the perspective that she's this female police officer, this female law enforcement officer trying to track a serial killer, but also just from a character standpoint alone, like from a standpoint of like character strength.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think really sticks out to me in this movie is how much time this movie dedicates to how vulnerable she is.
Yeah.
You first open on a scene of her running an FBI training course.
Yeah.
And you get the sense early on when she's talking to Jack Crawford that she's smart, she's smart, she's well learned, she's done a lot of things.
She works hard, clearly.
She works hard, clearly, but she's inexperienced.
Yeah.
And she has to face a lot of horrible, traumatizing stuff very early on. And there's this scene right after she exits the mental hospital where a very unpleasant thing happens to her in there. And as she's exiting the hospital, she has this flashback to her childhood. And as it cuts back to the present, you see her just crying in front of her car. And
it rests on that for a decent bit of time. And
that was great. You see the impact that this is having on her. But then the immediate next shot is her back at FBI training with her service revolver out, shooting right at camera.
Yeah.
She's back in the game, and she's doing her job. And this movie is really good at highlighting a character's vulnerability so that their moments of strength have more power.
It's what I think is missing from a lot of modern movies, and how I described it inside of my review is that she's out of place in the world. There's a shot that I highlighted inside of my review, and it's not even in the movie that long, but she loads up into this elevator, and she is wearing like this dark gray sweater. She's kind of like all like disheveled from like all the running, and there are the rest of these trainees. There's like
10 of them or so.
5 or 6. It's like they fill the elevator. They're all wearing the same red shirt, and they are all like 2 feet taller than her.
Right.
And she just kind of sits there like, and then the doors close. It's a small shot, but I always say that sums up the movie. She's out of place in the world, and it is a primarily male dominant world. That's what the world's built upon. People like look down upon her in like even the slightest of ways. It's not like the men are out to get her.
Yeah, it's not a movie about prejudice.
No.
But it's a movie about being alone.
Yes.
In a world that you don't really belong to.
It doesn't,
at least in some people's perspective.
Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily relate to gender, but it's just about that idea of like being misplaced, being like out of touch with like the rest where you're trying to fit in.
Yeah.
So
Lecter has a great line later in the movie where he's describing how Buffalo Bill operates, and he talks about how he covets things that he wants, and he looks at Clarice and says, like, don't you feel others' eyes on your body like coveting you, and don't you covet the things that your eyes rest upon? And one of the things I noticed is just in scenes where Clarice is walking around, not even interacting with people, the men around her almost always give her some attention.
Yes.
Whether it's creepy, whether it's disapproving, like almost every man she interacts with gives her this specific eye line. Like even the first man she comes into contact with.
I was literally about to say that. There's just a slight moment where he just looks off at her. Like
Right.
it isn't even all that big, but like every male character in this film like interacts with her. You gain something by body language of even just the eyes moving.
Right.
Where you understand a little bit something about that character, but you also understand about like how Clarice interacts with the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, like there's stuff like that with how like how she's characterized through other characters.
Yes.
Yeah. Great world building inside of it, so.
Yeah. And I mean, just from a standpoint, have you read Thomas Harris's book?
I have not. Have you?
I have. And this is one of my favorite examples of a movie taking a great book and adapting it to a screenplay and a film incredibly well. I would say that it's probably neck and neck with No Country for Old Men in terms of my favorite adaptation from novel to film, because it's basically the book. They basically like probably did what the Coen brothers did, just opened the book, wrote the screenplay from the book.
Why don't people do that more often? I don't know.
I think it's often hard depending on what you're adapting.
Especially bigger novels.
Exactly, and depending on how you want your movie to feel. Like No Country for Old Men is basically a pretty straightforward thriller.
It's cat and mouse, like.
And the
good
book
bad,
is
yeah.
too. And so I think what's great about both the book and the movie is they're basically the same thing. And they just adapted it the same way that you would expect to adapt it. So I love that this movie really has a great novel to back it up. I have less pleasant things to say about the sequels to those novels and the sequels to this film.
You've watched both of them?
I've watched Hannibal and
Red Dragon?
I have watched Red Dragon. Red Dragon's decent.
Yeah.
I have mixed feelings about Hannibal. I hate the book Hannibal. I completely agree. Ridley Scott, I don't want to dive into that too much, but Ridley Scott made several changes from the book Hannibal that I think were better.
But the movie still just didn't really work out.
The movie just doesn't land with the power it should. This movie does. Like this movie ends with a final brief conversation with Clarice and Lecter on the phone, and you're just left like, wow.
Yeah.
Like there's the scary factor of, oh no, Hannibal Lecter's in the world, but I love this like this last bit of conversation they have together where Lecter's just like, you did good.
Yeah.
You did good. Like it's a strangely respectful thing to come from this guy who almost spends the whole movie tearing into everyone he comes into contact with.
Yeah.
Like he almost spends every waking moment of his life trying to figure out how to hurt you.
He's trying,
even though he can't physically hurt you.
He's trying to gain the upper hand,
Yeah.
like on you, and like that's one of the things that's established earlier is he kills Miggs by literally just like talking to him, and like that's the thing, like
Yeah.
exactly, like he spends the entire movie like trying to gain the upper hand mentally,
Right.
And that's like one of the moments where he's like he doesn't need to do that anymore, and he just wants to have a conversation instead.
It's interesting because like Jack Crawford and like a lot of the people who before even Clarice talks to Hannibal for the first time, they warn her, don't do this, like don't give him anything, don't take anything from him, don't give him any personal details about your life. Something that slowly happens to the movie is she starts to break the rules. The second time she meets him, she takes a towel he gives her.
I noticed that the shot rests on it for a while, and I noticed like she's shot from a low angle, almost as if the towel represents like Hannibal's position.
Right.
And it's like there's this long pause, and eventually she does take it, and exactly like there's these slight tweaks where she like will bend the rules just enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then over time, she finally starts to give personal details about her life.
And then he touches her at the end, and I remember seeing that. I was like,
I love how
the first time I
heard
watched that.
you gasp.
He's
Like, because it's startling. You realize this whole movie that had zero physical contact.
Yeah,
And that
like
brief moment is like chilling.
It is. It's really freaky. I love seeing that the first time. I was like, oh my gosh, such build up in character. Yeah.
This is a movie that it's so funny. There's just so much to talk about. It's hard to like.
It's hard to discuss. It's better to like analyze. Like really, I'd much prefer to like make a video review that's like
you'd almost like need to go like scene by scene and like do a commentary on this movie. Because you could literally break down like a single scene and like find a lot of interesting stuff in it. I mean, I think the one thing, I don't know if we talked about it, like the whole idea with like first person. Did we talk about that?
We talked about a reverse shot. What did you want to talk about?
I wanted to talk about how often the first person perspective is used in this movie. One of the interesting things is like reverse shot is used to show intimacy between characters, but a lot of the times we're shown directly how Clarice is seeing the world. Like there's this moment where she steps into the outer area before she walks into the hallway where Lecter's cell is, and she just like the camera pans and it looks around and then it ends resting on Barney's face that she's seeing for the first time as he introduces himself to her. Like there's a lot of times where you're seeing the world through her eyes directly. Yeah. Like how she looks around, she sees the cops who have these odd, creepy, but also disapproving looks on her, and she kind of like looks down, and then you get this very famous bit at the end of the movie where you see a first-person perspective through the killer's eyes as he's looking at Clarice through these night vision goggles. So it's interesting because I don't think first-person perspective is often used in movies like this. Like,
and even if it is, it isn't quite noticed quite as much. Like when it does, it tends to stand out more. But like movies like this incorporate that better. And like even just character perspective where you realize you've been following a character. I always love that when you just read, you're like, oh my gosh, this character was in every single scene in the movie. There are a few movies like that where you can look that up and you're like, holy cow, this is just like one character's life story. And that's what it feels like with this. Like there's perspective changes, and like first person camera works a lot for that. Like it doesn't feel like a gimmick or a method. It feels like something which
it doesn't feel like a camera. It feels like you actually are standing in that person's shoes.
Yeah.
And in a movie like this, where it's ultimately all about someone feeling very out of place, very not outgunned, but overwhelmed by how inexperienced and looked down upon she is.
Yes.
Like in this movie, there are really only two people who seem to, at least by the end of the movie, fully respect her. That's Jack Crawford and Hannibal Lecter.
Yeah.
Almost every other man in this movie either openly is like Dr. Chilton, who's the hospital director, like openly a creepy dude. Who's like propositioning her after meeting her for 5 minutes, saying like, hey, you're pretty hot for a detective. And then you have like characters who are maybe dismissive of her and don't treat her seriously, but like there's only really two people who seem to actually respect her.
Yeah.
And she has to spend most of this movie dealing with people who do not respect her, who do not take her seriously, and she has to simply
fight through it.
Yes. And prove herself. And she does. She's really smart. She's really capable.
Yeah.
She figures out that Lecter early on was essentially telling her the truth, but in a very like cryptic way. And she deciphers it. And she figures things out in ways you're like, oh, like I can buy that.
Yeah.
Like you get the sense that she's good. She understands like the fundamentals of what she wants to do, which is she wants to do behavioral science. She wants to like study serial killers, and she gets it. And over the course of the movie, she starts to experience it and actually starts to apply that knowledge.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like her wanting to like achieve goals is like to prove something to like other people. It's just to prove. It's just to show that she can. Like she's doing it because she wants to like prove herself.
Yeah.
She's great. Like, holy cow.
We started this talking about how much we didn't want to talk about performances, but unfortunately it inevitably comes back to that because
really
so much
does.
of this movie is just full of great performances.
It is.
Shout out to Roger Corman, of all people, who shows up in like a one-scene wonder as the FBI director, which just made me laugh because I was just thinking, that's great.
It's acknowledged in the opening credits that I remember being like, who is Roger Corman in this movie? And right. Like, you saw that at the end. We're like, he's the FBI director. He's like, it's like on the phone for like 10 seconds in the movie, and he's like giving a credit.
Yeah.
I'm like, good on him. Fantastic for being there. So
yeah, this is a special movie. I think that it's so many movies have tried to be this movie since, and I think a lot, unfortunately, as what happens with a lot of great movies is they often can become just like the punchlines of jokes. Like everyone can do the whole like I ate his liver with some fava beans and all that, but really this movie is a fascinating peek into the world of what is it like to work at the FBI and hunt down monsters.
Yeah.
And what does that actually look like? And what would it be if you were like, what would it be like if you were like Clarice and were like fresh out of school and thrown into the middle of the lion's den?
Yeah, you could argue like a Sicario type idea with like us being the audience, like the main character being the audience surrogate. Like
right.
I'd say the character is a little more intriguing than that, but yeah, like we're in her shoes, and it's just like we're brought into that world. So yeah, like we've been briefly like touching upon, like this is a movie which like would be better to just make a video essay. It's the ultimate video essay film where you can take any scene and just like dissect it for exactly why it's great in different aspects. But it's still cool, really cool to discuss this movie. So
yeah,
you want to get into grades? I don't think there's any disputing here.
It's no disputing. This movie's an A+. It's got legendary performances. This is the performance that honestly has probably, for better or worse, made Anthony Hopkins' career. Like, he will be always remembered as this character.
Yes.
Regardless of what he's done since. But he's fabulous in this movie. He's a magnetic character. I would say that like some of the one of the only other characters that comes to mind in terms of just how magnetic and entrancing he is to watch is Heath Ledger as the Joker.
Yeah.
He's just,
and even him, like there's a lot of Lecter inside of him.
Oh,
like,
absolutely.
In his performance, yeah.
Like very little screen time, very big punch in terms of just presence on screen.
Yeah.
And enough cannot be said about Jodie Foster. She is great in this movie. Like her career was shot into orbit by this movie, and it's well deserved. She is the beating heart of this movie. Lecter is probably the biggest selling point, but without Jodie Foster, this movie wouldn't exist.
Yeah.
You needed that vulnerable, smart, scared, and intensely strong character at the center of this movie to make it work. And it's got a director who really understood the actual reality behind his subject. I know that Jonathan Demme actually like really worked hard to work with the actual Federal Bureau of Investigation, with behavioral sciences. One of my favorite on-set stories is Scott Glenn, who plays Jack Crawford. He worked with real FBI behavioral guys who actually tracked and hunted and captured serial killers. And he actually was given the opportunity to listen to voice recordings from two serial killers, I think, who operated back in the 1980s, called the Toolbox Killers. And he described the experience of listening to those tapes as just traumatizing. He wept listening to them. And by the end of filming, he felt like he had changed as a person. So all the crew really understood the reality, and I think that really translates well on screen. This feels like, yeah, I could see this movie happening. I could see a lot of this movie being reality.
Yeah. That was a hell of an outro.
Yeah.
I am going the same. I'm going to give this movie an A+. I always love watching masterpiece movies where like you've been told like for a long time that this movie is just amazing, and when you watch it, maybe you're not blown out of your seat exactly. Maybe like you figured a little bit more, you were expecting a little more, But at the same time, there's something always to go back to. Maybe you think about it a little bit later and you're like, something changes in your mind.
Right.
This is the second time I've watched this movie. The first time I watched it, I paid attention to performances and characters. And I got a lot out of it, the movie, for that. That was my original take that I wrote in my review, was about Clarice's character. That was my point of focus. And this time around, I focused on Jonathan Demme's direction. And I'm like, I'm sure if I watched it again, I'd focus on a different aspect, because like every different aspect of this film is like operating on like the same caliber of excellence. And it's a movie which has so many components you could look at, and it's just like I said, pick any scene in this movie and it's like the scenes are just great. It's a movie which is not amazing from like a story perspective per se, but it's just that every component of the film is operating at like peak level of what you could expect from a movie. And it's a movie which is just great for being simple and effective at pretty much everything that it is attempting to set out to do. So yeah. Silence of the Lambs is a masterpiece.
If you haven't seen this movie, you've got to see it.
Absolutely. It's sorry for spoiling a lot of stuff if you haven't, but
and if you get the chance, I'm pretty sure the screening we saw today was taken from the Criterion Collection. They re-released this movie on Blu Ray.
Yeah.
It looked gorgeous.
Yeah.
There were some scenes where I was like, wow, this is beautiful. Like, they restored the hell out of this movie. I actually own the Criterion, and I haven't watched it yet. And I was like, I'm watching this like, oh, this is the Criterion, I bet.
Yeah, man, it looked great. I think they've released it on a 4K for digital. I'm probably gonna record it for that to add some video footage. But yeah, holy crap, it's a fantastic movie. So yeah, definitely check it out if you haven't already. But yeah. All right. Thank you so much for watching. This is Three Brothers Movie Reviews, and please subscribe to the channel for more videos in the future.
See you guys.
If you made it this far into the video, it's likely because you really like our content. Or you skipped to the grade, in which case, please do watch the rest of our review or The Silence of the Lambs if you haven't seen it. But if the former is true, I wanted to take a minute to draw attention to something which you may not know. In our review, Daniel and I mentioned how The Silence of the Lambs is more of a film to analyze rather than to discuss. As it happens, I have a channel of my own called Film Diagnostics where I do just that. My reviews don't use any in-camera work or outside discussion. They are scripted and highly edited for the purposes of analyzing complex films or specific aspects of filmmaking. My latest video breaks down the use of framing during the conversation scenes in The Silence of the Lambs. I use many of the points which I mentioned in this review, but in a way which analyzes scenes shot for shot rather than in general. So do check that video out if you'd like a more scripted take on the film, and consider subscribing to my channel if you enjoy my structure. The next video I'll be working on is a breakdown of how the Russo brothers construct action sequences in anticipation of their next movie, Avengers Endgame. I will be taking my time with that script, but you can expect the video to be released around mid-April. I hope you guys enjoyed our review, and as always, please subscribe to the channel for more videos in the future.
A census taker once tried to test me. I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.